Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 9. The Art of Dreaming. The New Area of Exploration. Don Juan told me that in order to see in dreaming, not only did I have to intend seeing, but I had to put my intent into loud words. For reasons he refused to explain, he insisted that I had to speak up. He conceded that there are other means to accomplish the same result, but he asserted that voicing one's intent is the simplest and most direct way. The first time I put into words my intent to see, I was dreaming of a church bazaar. There were so many articles that I could not make up my mind which one to gaze at. A giant conspicuous vase in a corner made up my mind for me. I gazed at it, voicing my intent to see. The vase remained in my view for an instant, then it changed into another object. I gazed at as many things as I could in that dream. After I voiced my intent to see, every item I had chosen to gaze at vanished or turned into something else, as had happened all along in my dreaming practices. My dreaming attention was finally exhausted, and I woke up tremendously frustrated, almost angry. For months on end, I actually gazed at hundreds of items in my dreams and deliberately voiced my intent to see, but nothing ever happened. Tired of waiting, I finally had to ask Don Juan about it. You need to have patience. You are learning to do something extraordinary, he remarked. You are learning to intend to see in your dreams. Someday you will not have to voice your intent, you'll simply will it, silently. I think I have not understood the function of whatever I am doing, I said. Nothing happens when I shout my intent to see. What does that mean? It means that your dreams, so far, have been ordinary dreams, they have been phantom projections, images that have life only in your dreaming attention. He wanted to know exactly what had happened to the items on which I had focused my gaze. I said that they had vanished or changed shape or even produced vortexes that eventually changed my dreams. It has been like that in all my daily dreaming practices, I said. The only thing out of the ordinary is that I am learning to yell in my dreams, at the top of my voice. My last statement threw Don Juan into a genuine fit of belly laughter, which I found disconcerting. I failed to find the humor of my statement or the reason for his reaction. Someday you'll appreciate how funny all this is, he said as an answer to my silent protest. In the meantime, don't give up or get discouraged. Keep on trying. Sooner or later, you'll hit the right note. As usual, he was right. A couple of months later, I hit the jackpot. I had a most unusual dream. It started with the appearance of a scout from the inorganic beings world. The scouts, as well as the dreaming emissary, had been strangely absent from my dreams. I had not missed them or pondered their disappearance. In fact, I was so at ease without them I had even forgotten to ask Don Juan about their absence. In that dream, the scout had been, at first, a gigantic yellow topaz, which I had found stuck in the back of a drawer. The moment I voiced my intent to see, the topaz turned into a blob of sizzling energy. I feared that I would be compelled to follow it, so I moved my gaze away from the scout and focused it on an aquarium with tropical fish. I voiced my intent to see and got a tremendous surprise. The aquarium emitted a low greenish glow and changed into a large surrealist portrait of a bejeweled woman. The portrait emitted the same greenish glow when I voiced my intent to see. As I gazed at that glow, The whole dream changed. I was walking then on a street in a town that seemed familiar to me. It might have been Tucson. I gazed at a display of women's clothes in a store window and spoke out loud my intent to see. Instantly, a black mannequin, prominently displayed, began to glow. I gazed next at a celebrity who came at that moment to rearrange the window. She looked at me. After voicing my intent, I saw her glow. It was so stupendous that I was afraid some detail in her splendorous glow would trap me, but the woman moved inside the store before I had time to focus my total attention on her. I certainly intended to follow her inside, however, my dreaming attention was caught by a moving glow. It came to me charging, filled with hatred. There was loathing in it and viciousness. I jumped backward. The glow stopped its charge, a black substance swallowed me, and I woke up. These images were so vivid that I firmly believed I had seen energy, and my dream had been one of those conditions that Don Juan had called dreamlike energy generating. The idea that dreams can take place in the consensual reality of our daily world intrigued me, just as the dream images of the inorganic being's realm had intrigued me. This time, you not only saw energy but crossed a dangerous boundary, Don Juan said, after hearing my account. He reiterated that the drill for the third gate of dreaming is to make the energy body move on its own. In my last session, he said, I had unwittingly superseded the effect of that drill and crossed into another world. Your energy body moved, he said. It journeyed by itself. That kind of journeying is beyond your abilities at this moment, and something attacked you. What do you think it was, Don Juan? This is a predatorial universe. It could have been one of thousands of things existing out there. Why do you think it attacked me? For the same reason the inorganic beings attacked you. Because you made yourself available. Is it that clear-cut, Don Juan? Certainly. It's as clear-cut as what you would do if a strange-looking spider crept across your desk while you were writing. You'd squash it out of fright, rather than admire it or examine it. I was at a loss and searched for words to ask the proper question. I wanted to ask him where my dream had taken place, or what world I was in that dream. But those questions did not make any sense. I could gather that myself. Don Juan was very understanding. You want to know where your dreaming attention was focused, don't you? He asked with a grin. This was exactly how I wanted to word my question. I reasoned that in the dream under consideration, I must have been looking at some real object. Just like what had happened when I saw in dreams the minute details on the floor or the walls or the door of my room, details that I later had corroborated, existed. Don Juan said that in special dreams, like the one I'd had, our dreaming attention focuses on the daily world, and that it moves instantly from one real object to another in the world. What makes this movement possible is that the assemblage point is on the proper dreaming position. From that position, the assemblage point gives the dreaming attention such fluidity that it can move in a split second over incredible distances, and in doing so, it produces a perception so fast, so fleeting that it resembles an ordinary dream. Don Juan explained that in my dream I had seen a real vase, and then my dreaming attention had moved over distances to see a real surrealist painting of a bejeweled woman. The result, with the exception of seeing energy, had been very close to an ordinary dream, in which items, when gazed at, quickly turn into something else. I know how disturbing this is, he went on, definitely aware of my bewilderment. For some reason pertinent to the mind, to see energy in dreaming is more upsetting than anything one can think of. I remarked that I had seen energy in dreaming before, yet it had never affected me like this. Now your energy body is complete and functioning, he said. Therefore, the implication that you see energy in your dream is that you are perceiving a real world through the veil of a dream. That's the importance of the journey you took. It was real. It involved energy-generating items that nearly ended your life. Was it that serious, Don Juan? You bet. The creature that attacked you was made of pure awareness and was as deadly as anything can be. You saw its energy. I am sure that you realize by now that unless we see in dreaming, we can't tell a real, energy-generating thing from a phantom projection. So, even though you battled the inorganic beings and indeed saw the scouts in the tunnels, your energy body doesn't know for sure if they were real, meaning energy generating. You are 99, but not 100% sure. Don Juan insisted on talking about the journey I had taken. For inexplicable reasons, I was reluctant to deal with that subject. What he was saying produced an instantaneous reaction in me. I found myself trying to come to grips with a deep, strange fear. It was dark and obsessive in a nagging, visceral way. You definitely went into another layer of the onion, Don Juan said, finishing a statement to which I had not paid attention. What is this other layer of the onion, Don Juan? The world is like an onion, it has many skins. The world we know is but one of them. Sometimes, we cross boundaries and enter into another skin. Another world, very much like this one, but not the same. And you entered into one, all by yourself. How is this journey you're talking about possible, Don Juan? That is a meaningless question, because no one can answer it. In the view of sorcerers, the universe is constructed in layers, which the energy body can cross. Do you know where the old sorcerers are still existing to this day? In another layer, in another skin of the onion. For me, the idea of a real, pragmatic journey, taken in dreams, is very difficult to understand or to accept, Don Juan. We have discussed this topic to exhaustion. I was convinced you understood that the journey of the energy body depends exclusively on the position of the assemblage point. You've told me that. And I have been mulling it over and over, still, saying that the journey is in the position of the assemblage point doesn't say anything to me. Your problem is your cynicism. I was just like you. Cynicism doesn't allow us to make drastic changes in our understanding of the world. It also forces us to feel that we are always right. I understood his point to perfection, but I reminded him about my fight against all that. I proposed that you do one nonsensical thing that might turn the tide, he said. Repeat to yourself incessantly that the hinge of sorcery is the mystery of the assemblage point. If you repeat this to yourself long enough, some unseen force takes over and makes the appropriate changes in you. Don Juan did not give me any indication that he was being facetious. I knew he meant every word of it. What bothered me was his insistence that I repeat the formula ceaselessly to myself. I caught myself thinking that all of it was asinine. Cut your cynical attitude, he snapped at me. Repeat this in a bona fide manner. The mystery of the assemblage point is everything in sorcery, he continued, without looking at me. Or rather, everything in sorcery rests on the manipulation of the assemblage point. You know all this, but you have to repeat it. For an instant, As I heard his remarks, I thought I was going to die of anguish. An incredible sense of physical sadness gripped my chest and made me scream with pain. My stomach and diaphragm seemed to be pushing up, moving into my chest cavity. The push was so intense that my awareness changed levels, and I entered into my normal state. Whatever we had been talking about became a vague thought about something that might have happened but actually had not, according to the mundane reasoning of my everyday life consciousness. The next time Don Juan and I talked about dreaming, we discussed the reasons I had been unable to proceed with my dreaming practices for months on end. Don Juan warned me that to explain my situation he had to go in a roundabout way. He pointed out, first, that there is an enormous difference between the thoughts and deeds of the men of antiquity and those of modern men. Then he pointed out that the men of ancient times had a very realistic view of perception and awareness, because their views stemmed from their observations of the universe around them. Modern men, in contrast, have an absurdly unrealistic view of perception and awareness, because their view stems from their observations of the social order and from their dealings with it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you are a modern man involved with the views and observations of men of antiquity," he replied. "And none of those views and observations are familiar to you. Now more than ever you need sobriety and aplomb. I am trying to make a solid bridge, a bridge you can walk on, between the views of men of ancient times and those of modern men." He remarked that of all the transcendental observations of the men of ancient times, the only one with which I was familiar, because it had filtered down to our day, was the idea of selling our souls to the devil in exchange for immortality, which he admitted sounded to him like something coming straight out of the relationship of the old sorcerers with the inorganic beings. He reminded me how the dreaming emissary had tried to induce me to stay in its realm by offering me the possibility of maintaining my individuality and self-awareness for nearly an eternity. As you know, succumbing to the lure of the inorganic beings is not just an idea, it's real, Don Juan went on. But you haven't yet fully realized the implication of that realness. Dreaming, likewise, is real. It is an energy-generating condition. You hear my statements and you certainly understand what I mean, but your awareness hasn't caught up with the total implication of it yet. Don Juan said that my rationality knew the import of a realization of this nature, and during our last talk, it had forced my awareness to change levels. I ended up in my normal awareness before I could deal with the nuances of my dream. My rationality had further protected itself by suspending my dreaming practices. "I assure you that I am fully aware of what an energy-generating condition means," I said. "And I assure you that you are not," he retorted. "If you were, you would measure dreaming with greater care and deliberation. Since you believe you are just dreaming, you take blind chances. Your faulty reasoning tells you that no matter what happens, at a given moment the dream will be over, and you will wake up." He was right. In spite of all the things I had witnessed in my dreaming practices, somehow I still retained the general sense that all of it had been a dream. I am talking to you about the views of men of antiquity and the views of modern man, Don Juan went on, because your awareness, which is the awareness of modern man, prefers to deal with an unfamiliar concept as if it were an empty ideality. If I left it up to you, you'd regard dreaming as an idea. Of course. I'm sure you take dreaming seriously, but you don't quite believe in the reality of dreaming. I understand what you are saying, Don Juan, but I don't understand why you are saying it. I am saying all this because you are now, for the first time, in the proper position to understand that dreaming is an energy-generating condition. For the first time, you can understand now that ordinary dreams are the honing devices used to train the assemblage point to reach the position that creates this energy-generating condition we call dreaming. He warned me that, since dreamers touch and enter real worlds of all-inclusive effects, they ought to be in a permanent state of the most intense and sustained alertness. Any deviation from total alertness imperils the dreamer in ways more than dreadful. I began again, at this point, to experience a movement in my chest cavity, exactly as I had felt the day my awareness changed levels by itself. Don Juan forcibly shook me by the arm. Regard dreaming as something extremely dangerous, he commanded me. And begin that now. Don't start any of your weird maneuvers. His tone of voice was so urgent that I stopped whatever I was, unconsciously, doing. What is going on with me, Don Juan? I asked. What's going on with you is that you can displace your assemblage point quickly and easily, he said. Yet that ease has the tendency to make the displacement erratic. Bring your ease to order. And don't allow yourself even a fraction of an inch leeway. I could easily have argued that I did not know what he was talking about, but I knew. I also knew I had only a few seconds to round up my energy and change my attitude, and I did. This was the end of our exchange that day. I went home, and for nearly a year I faithfully and daily repeated what Don Juan had asked me to say. The results of my litany-like invocation were incredible. I was firmly convinced that it had the same effect on my awareness that exercise has on the muscles of the body. My assemblage point became more agile, which meant that seeing energy and dreaming became the sole goal of my practices. My skill at intending to see grew in proportion to my efforts. A moment came when I was able just to intend seeing, without saying a word, and actually experience the same result as when I voiced out loud my intent to see. Don Juan congratulated me on my accomplishment. I, naturally, assumed he was being facetious. He assured me that he meant it, but beseeched me to continue shouting, at least whenever I was at a loss. His request did not seem odd to me. On my own, I had been yelling in my dreams at the top of my voice every time I deemed it necessary. I discovered that the energy of our world wavers. It scintillates. Not only living beings, but everything in our world glimmers with an inner light of its own. Don Juan explained that the energy of our world consists of layers of shimmering hues. The top layer is whitish, another, immediately adjacent to it, is chartreuse, and another one, more distant yet, is amber. I found all those hues, or rather I saw glimmers of them whenever items that I encountered in my dreamlike states changed shapes. However, a whitish glow was always the initial impact of seeing anything that generated energy. Are there only 3 different hues? I asked Don Juan. There is an endless number of them, he replied, but for the purposes of a beginning order, you should be concerned with those 3. Later on, you can get as sophisticated as you want and isolate dozens of hues, if you are able to do it. The whitish layer is the hue of the present position of mankind's assemblage point, Don Juan continued. Let's say that it is a modern hue. Sorcerers believe that everything man does nowadays is tinted with that whitish glow. At another time, The position of mankind's assemblage point made the hue of the ruling energy in the world chartreuse, and at another time, more distant yet, it made it amber. The color of sorcerer's energy is amber, which means that they are energetically associated with the men who existed in a distant past. Do you think, Don Juan, that the present whitish hue will change someday? If man is capable of evolving. The grand task of sorcerers is to bring forth the idea that, in order to evolve, man must first free his awareness from its bindings to the social order. Once awareness is free, intent will redirect it into a new evolutionary path. Do you think sorcerers will succeed in that task? They have already succeeded. They themselves are the proof. To convince others of the value and import of evolving is another matter. The other kind of energy I found present in our world but alien to it was the scout's energy, the energy Don Juan had called sizzling. I encountered scores of items in my dreams that, once I saw them, turned into blobs of energy that seemed to be frying, bubbling with some heat-like inner activity. Bear in mind that not every scout you are going to find belongs to the realm of inorganic beings, Don Juan remarked. Every scout you have found so far, except for the Blue Scout, has been from that realm, but that was because the inorganic beings were catering to you. They were directing the show. Now you are on your own. Some of the scouts you will encounter are going to be not from the inorganic beings realm, but from other, even more distant levels of awareness. Are the scouts aware of themselves? I asked. Most certainly, he replied. Then why don't they make contact with us when we are awake? They do. But our great misfortune is to have our consciousness so fully engaged that we don't have time to pay attention. In our sleep, however, the two-way traffic trapdoor opens. We dream. And in our dreams, we make contact. Is there any way to tell whether the scouts are from a level besides the inorganic beings world? The greater their sizzling, the farther they come from. It sounds simplistic, but you have to let your energy body tell you what is what. I assure you, it'll make very fine distinctions and unerring judgments when faced with alien energy. He was right again. Without much ado, my energy body distinguished two general types of alien energy. The first was the scouts from the inorganic beings realm. Their energy fizzled mildly. There was no sound to it, but it had all the overt appearance of effervescence, or of water that is starting to boil. The energy of the second general type of scouts gave me the impression of considerably more power. Those scouts seemed to be just about to burn. They vibrated from within as if they were filled with pressurized gas. My encounters with the alien energy were always fleeting because I paid total attention to what Don Juan recommended. He said, unless you know exactly what you are doing and what you want out of alien energy, you have to be content with a brief glance. Anything beyond a glance is as dangerous and as stupid as petting a rattlesnake. Why is it dangerous, Don Juan? I asked. Scouts are always very aggressive and extremely daring, he said. They have to be that way in order to prevail in their explorations. Sustaining our dreaming attention on them is tantamount to soliciting their awareness to focus on us. Once they focus their attention on us, we are compelled to go with them. And that, of course, is the danger. We may end up in worlds beyond our energetic possibilities. Don Juan explained that there are many more types of scouts than the two I had classified, but that at my present level of energy, I could only focus on 3. He described the first two types as the easiest to spot. Their disguises in our dreams are so outlandish, he said, that they immediately attract our dreaming attention. He depicted the scouts of the third type as the most dangerous, in terms of aggressiveness and power, and because they hide behind subtle disguises. One of the strangest things dreamers find, which you yourself will find presently, Don Juan continued, is this third type of scout. So far, you have found samples of only the first two types, but that's because you haven't looked in the right place. And what is the right place, Don Juan? You have again fallen prey to words. This time the culprit word is items, which you have taken to mean only things, objects. Well, the most ferocious scout hides behind people in our dreams. A formidable surprise was in store for me, in my dreaming, when I focused my gaze on the dream image of my mother. After I voiced my intent to see, she turned into a ferocious, frightening bubble of sizzling energy. Don Juan paused to let his statement sink in. I felt stupid for being disturbed at the possibility of finding a scout behind the dream image of my mother. It's annoying that they are always associated with the dream images of our parents or close friends, he went on. Perhaps that's why we often feel ill at ease when we dream of them. His grin gave me the impression that he was enjoying my turmoil. A rule of thumb for dreamers is to assume that the third type of scout is present whenever they feel perturbed by their parents or friends in a dream. Sound advice is to avoid those dream images. They are sheer poison. Where does the blue scout stand in relation to the other scouts? I asked. Blue energy doesn't sizzle, he replied. It is like ours, it wavers, but it is blue instead of white. Blue energy doesn't exist in a natural state in our world. And this brings us to something we've never talked about. What color were the scouts you've seen so far? Until the moment he mentioned it, I had never thought about this. I told Don Juan that the scouts I had seen were either pink or reddish. And he said that the deadly scouts of the third type were bright orange. I found out myself that the third type of scout is outright scary. Every time I found one of them, it was behind the dream images of my parents, especially of my mother. Seeing it always reminded me of the blob of energy that had attacked me in my first deliberate seeing dream. Every time I found it, the alien exploring energy actually seemed about to jump on me. My energy body used to react with horror even before I saw it. During our next discussion of dreaming, I queried Don Juan about the total absence of inorganic beings in my dreaming practices. Why don't they show up anymore? I asked. They only show themselves at the beginning, he explained. After their scouts take us to their world, there is no necessity for the inorganic beings' projections. If we want to see the inorganic beings, a scout takes us there. For no one, and I mean no one, can journey by himself to their realm. Why is that so, Don Juan? Their world is sealed. No one can enter or leave without the consent of the inorganic beings. The only thing you can do by yourself once you are inside is, of course, voice your intent to stay. To say it out loud means to set in motion currents of energy that are irreversible. In olden times, words were incredibly powerful. Now they are not. In the inorganic being's realm, they haven't lost their power. Don Juan laughed and said that he had no business saying anything about the inorganic being's world, because I really knew more about it than he and all his companions combined. There is one last issue related to that world that we haven't discussed, he said. He paused for a long while, as if searching for the appropriate words. In the final analysis, he began, my aversion to the old sorcerer's activities is very personal. As an Agwal, I detest what they did. They cowardly sought refuge in the inorganic being's world. They argued that in a predatorial universe, poised to rip us apart, the only possible haven for us is in that realm. Why did they believe that? I asked. Because it's true, he said. Since the inorganic beings can't lie, the sales pitch of the dreaming emissary is all true. That world can give us shelter and prolong our awareness for nearly an eternity. The emissary's sales pitch, even if it's the truth, has no appeal to me, I said. Do you mean you will chance a road that might rip you apart? He asked with a note of bewilderment in his voice. I assured Don Juan that I did not want the inorganic being's world, no matter what advantages it offered. My statement seemed to please him to no end. You are ready then for one final statement about that world. The most dreadful statement I can make, he said, and tried smile but did not quite make it. Don Juan searched in my eyes, I suppose for a glimmer agreement or comprehension. He was silent for a moment. The energy necessary to move the assemblage points of sorcerers comes from the realm of inorganic beings, he said, as if he were hurrying to get it over with. My heart nearly stopped. I felt a vertigo and had to stomp my feet on the ground not to faint. This is the truth, Don Juan went on, and the legacy of the old sorcerers to us. They have us pinned down to this day. This is the reason I don't like them. I resent having to dip into one source alone. Personally, I refuse to do it. And I have tried to steer you away from it. But with no success, because something pulls you to that world, like a magnet. I understood Don Juan better than I could have thought. Journeying to that world had always meant to me, at an energetic level, a boost of dark energy. I had even thought of it in those terms, long before Don Juan voiced his statement. What can we do about it? I asked. We can't have dealings with them, he answered, and yet we can't stay away from them. My solution has been to take their energy but not give in to their influence. This is known as the ultimate stalking. It is done by sustaining the unbending intent of freedom, even though no sorcerer knows what freedom really is. Can you explain to me, Don Juan, why sorcerers have to take energy from the realm of inorganic beings? There is no other viable energy for sorcerers. In order to maneuver the assemblage point in the manner they do, sorcerers need an inordinate amount of energy. I reminded him of his own statement. That a redeployment of energy is necessary in order to do dreaming. That is correct, he replied. To start dreaming, sorcerers need to redefine their premises and save their energy. But that redefining is valid only to have the necessary energy to set up dreaming. To fly into other realms, to see energy, to forge the energy body, etc., is another matter. For those maneuvers, sorcerers need loads of dark alien energy. But how do they take it from the inorganic being's world? By the mere act of going to that world. All the sorcerers of our line have to do this. However, none of us is idiotic enough to do what you've done. But this is because none of us has your proclivities. Don Juan sent me home to ponder what he had revealed to me. I had endless questions, but he did not want to hear any of them. All the questions you have, you can answer yourself, he said as he waved goodbye to me. Stalking the stalkers. At home, I soon realized that it was impossible for me to answer any of my questions. In fact, I could not even formulate them. Perhaps that was because the boundary of the second attention had begun to collapse on me. This was when I met Florinda Grau and Carol Tiggs in the world of everyday life. The confusion of not knowing them at all yet knowing them so intimately that I would have died for them at the drop of a hat was most deleterious to me. I had met Taisha Abler a few years before, and I was just beginning to get used to the confounded feeling of knowing her without having the vaguest idea of how. To add two more people to my overloaded system proved too much for me. I got ill out of fatigue and had to seek Don Juan's aid. I went to the town in southern Mexico where he and his companions lived. Don Juan and his fellow sorcerers laughed uproariously at the mere mention of my turmoils. Don Juan explained to me that they were not really laughing at me but at themselves. My cognitive problems reminded them of the ones they had had when the boundary of the second attention had collapsed on them, just as it had on me. Their awareness, like mine, had not been prepared for it, he said. Every sorcerer goes through the same agony, Don Juan went on. Awareness is an endless area of exploration for sorcerers and man in general. In order to enhance awareness, there is no risk we should not run, no means we should refuse. Bear in mind, however, that only in soundness of mind can awareness be enhanced. Don Juan reiterated, then, that his time was coming to an end, and that I had to use my resources wisely to cover as much ground as I could before he left. Talk like that used to throw me into states of profound depression. But as the time of his departure approached, I had begun to react with more resignation. I no longer felt depressed, but I still panicked. Nothing else was said after that. The next day, at his request, I drove Don Juan to Mexico City. We arrived around noon and went directly to the Hotel del Prado in the Paseo Alameda, the place he usually lodged when he was in the city. Don Juan had an appointment with a lawyer that day at 4 in the afternoon. Since we had plenty of time, we went to have lunch in the famous Café Tacuba, a restaurant in the heart of downtown, where it was purported that real meals were served. Don Juan was not hungry. He ordered only 2 sweet tamales, while I gorged myself on a sumptuous feast. He laughed at me and made signs of silent despair at my healthy appetite. "I'm going to propose a line of action for you," he said in a curt tone when we had finished our lunch. "It's the last task of the third gate of dreaming, and it consists of stalking the stalkers, a most mysterious maneuver. To stalk the stalkers means to deliberately draw energy from the inorganic being's realm in order to perform a sorcery feat." "What kind of sorcery feat, Don Juan?" A journey that uses awareness as an element of the environment," he explained. "In the world of daily life, water is an element of the environment that we use for traveling. Imagine awareness being a similar element that can be used for traveling. Through the medium of awareness, scouts from all over the universe come to us, and vice versa, via awareness, sorcerers go to the ends of the universe." There had been certain concepts, among the hosts of concepts Don Juan had made me aware of in the course of his teachings, that attracted my full interest without any coaxing. This was one. "The idea that awareness is a physical element is revolutionary," I said in awe. "I didn't say it's a physical element," he corrected me. "It's an energetic element. You have to make that distinction. For sorcerers who see, awareness is a glow. They can hitch their energy body to that glow and go with it. What's the difference between a physical and an energetic element? I asked. The difference is that physical elements are part of our interpretation system, but energetic elements are not. Energetic elements, like awareness, exist in our universe. But we, as average people, perceive only the physical elements because we were taught to do so. Sorcerers perceive the energetic elements for the same reason. They were taught to do so. Don Juan explained that the use of awareness as an energetic element of our environment is the essence of sorcery, that in terms of practicalities, the trajectory of sorcery is, first, to free the existing energy in us by impeccably following the sorcerer's path. Second, to use that energy to develop the energy body by means of dreaming. And third, to use awareness as an element of the environment in order to enter with the energy body and all our physicality into other worlds. There are two kinds of energy journeys into other worlds, he went on. One is when awareness picks up the sorcerer's energy body and takes it wherever it may. And the other is when the sorcerer decides, in full consciousness, to use the avenue of awareness to make a journey. You've done the first kind of journeying. It takes an enormous discipline to do the second. After a long silence, Don Juan stated that in the life of sorcerers, there are issues that require masterful handling, and that dealing with awareness, as an energetic element open to the energy body, is the most important, vital, and dangerous of those issues. I had no comment. I was suddenly on pins and needles, hanging on every one of his words. By yourself, you don't have enough energy to perform the last task of the third gate of dreaming, he went on, but you and Carol Tiggs together can certainly do what I have in mind. He paused, deliberately egging me on with his silence to ask what he had in mind. I did. His laughter only increased the ominous mood. I want you two to break the boundaries of the normal world and, using awareness as an energetic element, enter into another, he said. This breaking and entering amounts to stalking the stalkers. Using awareness as an element of the environment bypasses the influence of the inorganic beings, but it still uses their energy. He did not want to give me any more information in order not to influence me, he said. His belief was that the less I knew beforehand the better off I would be. I disagreed, but he assured me that, in a pinch, my energy body was perfectly capable of taking care of itself. We went from the restaurant to the lawyer's office. Don Juan quickly concluded his business, and we were, in no time at all, in a taxi on our way to the airport. Don Juan informed me that Carol Tiggs was arriving on a flight from Los Angeles, and that she was coming to Mexico City exclusively to fulfill this last dreaming task with me. The Valley of Mexico is a superb place to perform the kind of sorcery feat you are after, he commented. You haven't told me yet what the exact steps to follow are, I said. He didn't answer me. We did not speak anymore, but while we waited for the plane to land, he explained the procedure I had to follow. I had to go to Carol's room at the Regis Hotel, across the street from our hotel, and, after getting into a state of total inner silence, with her I had to slip gently into dreaming, voicing our intent to go to the realm of the inorganic beings. I interrupted to remind him that I always had to wait for a scout to show up before I could manifest out loud my intent to go to the inorganic beings' world. Don Juan chuckled and said, You haven't dreamt with Carol Tiggs yet. You'll find out that it's a treat. Sorceresses don't need any props. They just go to that world whenever they want to. For them, there is a scout on permanent call. I could not bring myself to believe that a sorceress would be able to do what he was asserting. I thought I had a degree of expertise in handling the inorganic being's world. When I mentioned to him what was going through my mind, he retorted that I had no expertise whatsoever when it came to what sorceresses are capable of. Why do you think I had Carol Tiggs with me to pull you bodily out of that world? He asked. Do you think it was because she's beautiful? Why was it, Don Juan? Because I couldn't do it myself, and for her, it was nothing. She has a knack for that world. Is she an exceptional case, Don Juan? Women in general have a natural bent for that realm. Sorceresses are, of course, the champions, but Carol Tiggs is better than anyone I know, because she, as the Nagwal woman, has superb energy. I thought I had caught Don Juan in a serious contradiction. He had told me that the inorganic beings were not interested at all in women. Now he was asserting the opposite. No. I'm not asserting the opposite, he remarked when I confronted him. I've said to you that the inorganic beings don't pursue females, they only go after males. But I've also said to you that the inorganic beings are female, and that the entire universe is female to a large degree. So draw your own conclusions. Since I had no way to draw any conclusions, Don Juan explained to me that sorceresses, in theory, come and go as they please in that world because of their enhanced awareness and their femaleness. Do you know this for a fact? I asked. The women of my party have never done that, he confessed, not because they can't, but because I dissuaded them. The women of your party, on the other hand, do it like changing skirts. I felt a vacuum in my stomach. I really did not know anything about the women of my party. Don Juan consoled me, saying that my circumstances were different from his, as was my role as an Nagwal. He assured me that I did not have it in me to dissuade any of the women of my party, even if I stood on my head. As the taxi drove us to her hotel, Carol delighted Don Juan and me with her impersonations of people we knew. I tried to be serious and questioned her about our task. She mumbled some apologies for not being able to answer me with the seriousness I deserved. Don Juan laughed uproariously when she mimicked my solemn tone of voice. After registering Carol at the hotel, the three of us meandered around downtown, looking for second-hand bookstores. We ate a light dinner at the Sanborn's restaurant in the House of Tiles. About 10 o'clock, we walked to the Regis Hotel. We went directly to the elevator. My fear had sharpened my capacity to perceive details. The hotel building was old and massive. The furniture in the lobby had obviously seen better days. Yet there was still, all around us, something left of an old glory that had a definite appeal. I could easily understand why Carol liked that hotel so much. Before we got into the elevator, my anxiety mounted to such heights that I had to ask Don Juan for last-minute instructions. Tell me again how we are going to proceed, I begged. Don Juan pulled us to the huge ancient stuffed chairs in the lobby and patiently explained to us that, once we were in the world of the inorganic beings, we had to voice our intent to transfer our normal awareness to our energy bodies. He suggested that Carol and I voice our intent together, although that part was not really important. What was important, he said, was that each of us intend the transfer of the total awareness of our daily world to our energy body. How do we do this transference of awareness? I asked. Transferring awareness is purely a matter of voicing our intent and having the necessary amount of energy, he said. Carol knows all this. She's done it before. She entered physically into the inorganic being's world when she pulled you out of it, remember? Her energy will do the trick. It'll tip the scales. What does it mean to tip the scales? I am in limbo, Don Juan. Don Juan explained that to tip the scales meant to add one's total physical mass to the energy body. He said that using awareness as a medium to make the journey into another world is not the result of applying any techniques, but the corollary of intending and having enough energy. The bulk of energy from Carol Tiggs added to mine, or the bulk of my energy added to Carol's, was going to make us into one single entity, energetically capable of pulling our physicality and placing it on the energy body in order to make that journey. What exactly do we have to do in order to enter into that other world? Carol asked. Her question scared me half to death. I thought she knew what was going on. Your total physical mass has to be added to your energy body, Don Juan replied, looking into her eyes. The great difficulty of this maneuver is to discipline the energy body, a thing the two of you have already done. Lack of discipline is the only reason the two of you may fail in performing this feat of ultimate stalking. Sometimes, as a fluke, an average person ends up performing it and entering into another world. But this is immediately explained away as insanity or hallucination. I would have given anything in the world for Don Juan to continue talking. But he put us in the elevator, and we went up to the second floor, to Carol's room, despite my protests and my rational need to know. Deep down, however, my turmoil was not so much that I needed to know, the bottom line was my fear. Somehow, this sorcerer's maneuver was more frightening to me than anything I had done so far. Don Juan's parting words to us were forget the self and you will fear nothing. His grin and the nodding of his head were invitations to ponder the statement. Carol laughed and began to clown, imitating Don Juan's voice as he gave us his cryptic instructions. Her lisping added quite a bit of color to what Don Juan had said. Sometimes I found her lisping adorable. Most of the time, I detested it. Fortunately, that night her lisping was hardly noticeable. We went to her room and sat down on the edge of the bed. My last conscious thought was that the bed was a relic from the beginning of the century. Before I had time to utter a single word, I found myself in a strange-looking bed. Carol was with me. She half sat up at the same time I did. We were naked, each covered with a thin blanket. "What's going on?" she asked in a feeble voice. "Are you awake?" I asked inanely. "Of course I am awake," she said in an impatient tone. "Do you remember where we were?" I asked. There was a long silence, as she obviously tried to put her thoughts in order. "I think I am real, but you are not," she finally said. "I know where I was before this. And you want to trick me." I thought she was doing the same thing herself. She knew what was going on and was testing me or pulling my leg. Don Juan had told me that her demons and mine were caginess and distrust. I was having a grand sample of that. "I refuse to be part of any shit where you are in control," she said. She looked at me with venom in her eyes. "I am talking to you, whoever you are." She took one of the blankets we had been covered with and wrapped herself with it. "I am going to lie here and go back to where I came from," she said, with an air of finality. "You and the nag will go and play with each other. You have to stop this nonsense, I said forcefully. We are in another world. She didn't pay any attention and turned her back to me like an annoyed, pampered child. I did not want to waste my dreaming attention in futile discussions of realness. I began to examine my surroundings. The only light in the room was moonlight shining through the window directly in front of us. We were in a small room, on a high bed. I noticed that the bed was primitively constructed. 4 thick posts had been planted in the ground, and the bed frame was a lattice, made of long poles attached to the posts. The bed had a thick mattress, or rather a compact mattress. There were no sheets or pillows. Filled burlap sacks were stacked up against the walls. 2 sacks by the foot of the bed, staggered one on top of the other, served as a stepladder to climb onto it. Looking for a light switch, I became aware that the high bed was in a corner, against a wall. Our heads were to the wall. I was on the outside of the bed and Carol on the inside. When I sat on the edge of the bed, I realized that it was perhaps over 3 feet above the ground. Carol sat up suddenly and said with a heavy lisp, "This is disgusting." The Nagwal certainly didn't tell me I was going to end up like this. I didn't know it either, I said. I wanted to say more and start a conversation, but my anxiety had grown to extravagant proportions. "You shut up," she snapped at me, her voice cracking with anger. "You don't exist. You're a ghost. Disappear. Disappear." Her lisping was actually cute and distracted me from my obsessive fear. I shook her by the shoulders. She yelled, not so much in pain as in surprise or annoyance. "I'm not a ghost," I said. "We made the journey because we joined our energy." Carol Tiggs was famous among us for her speed in adapting to any situation. In no time at all she was convinced of the realness of our predicament and began to look for her clothes in the semi-darkness. I marveled at the fact that she was not afraid. She became busy, reasoning out loud where she might have put her clothes had she gone to bed in that room. "Do you see any chair?" she asked. I faintly saw a stack of 3 sacks that might have served as a table or high bench. She got out of the bed, went to it, and found her clothes and mine, neatly folded, the way she always handled garments. She handed my clothes to me. They were my clothes, but not the ones I had been wearing a few minutes before, in Carol's room at the Regis Hotel. "These are not my clothes," she lisped. "And yet they are mine. How strange." We dressed in silence. I wanted to tell her that I was about to burst with anxiety. I also wanted to comment on the speed of our journey, but, in the time I had taken to dress, the thought of our journey had become very vague. I could hardly remember where we had been before waking up in that room. It was as if I had dreamt a hotel room. I made a supreme effort to recollect, to push away the vagueness that had begun to envelop me. I succeeded in dispelling the fog, but that act exhausted all my energy. I ended up panting and sweating. "Something nearly got me," Carol said. I looked at her. She, like me, was covered with perspiration. "It nearly got you too. What do you think it is?" "The position of the assemblage point," I said with absolute certainty. She did not agree with me. "It's the inorganic beings collecting their dues," she said, shivering. "The Nagwal told me it was going to be horrible, but I never imagined anything this horrible." I was in total agreement with her. We were in a horrifying mess, yet I could not conceive what the horror of that situation was. Carol and I were not novices. We had seen and done endless things, some of them outright terrifying. But there was something in that dream room that chilled me beyond belief. "We are dreaming, aren't we?" Carol asked. Without hesitation, I reassured her that we were, although I would have given anything to have Don Juan there to reassure me of the same thing. "Why am I so frightened?" she asked me, as if I were capable of rationally explaining it. Before I could formulate a thought about it, she answered her question herself. She said that what frightened her was to realize, at a body level, that perceiving is an all-inclusive act when the assemblage point has been immobilized on one position. She reminded me that Don Juan had told us that the power our daily world has over us is a result of the fact that our assemblage point is immobile on its habitual position. This immobility is what makes our perception of the world so inclusive and overpowering that we cannot escape from it. Carol also reminded me about another thing the Nagwal had said. That if we want to break this totally inclusive force, all we have to do is dispel the fog, that is to say, displace the assemblage point by intending its displacement. I had never really understood what Don Juan meant until the moment I had to bring my assemblage point to another position in order to dispel that world's fog, which had begun to swallow me. Carol and I, without saying another word, went to the window and looked out. We were in the country. The moonlight revealed some low, dark shapes of dwelling structures. By all indications, we were in the utility or supply room of a farm or a big country house. "Do you remember going to bed here?" Carol asked. "I almost do," I said and meant it. I told her I had to fight to keep the image of her hotel room in my mind as a point of reference. "I have to do the same," she said in a frightened whisper. "I know that if we let go of that memory, we are goners." Then she asked me if I wanted us to leave that shack and venture outside. I did not. My apprehension was so acute that I was unable to voice my words. I could only give her a signal with my head. "You are so very right not to want to go out," she said. "I have the feeling that if we leave this shack, we'll never make it back." I was going to open the door and just look outside, but she stopped me. "Don't do that," she said. "You might let the outside in." The thought that crossed my mind at that instant was that we had been placed inside a frail cage. Anything, such as opening the door, might upset the precarious balance of that cage. At the moment I had that thought, both of us had the same urge. We took off our clothes as if our lives depended on that. We then jumped into the high bed without using the 2 sack steps, only to jump down from it in the next instant. It was evident that Carol and I had the same realization at the same time. She confirmed my assumption when she said, "Anything that we use belonging to this world can only weaken us." If I stand here naked and away from the bed and away from the window, I don't have any problem remembering where I came from. But if I lie in that bed or wear those clothes or look out the window, I am done for. We stood in the center of the room for a long time, huddled together. A weird suspicion began to fester in my mind. "How are we going to return to our world?" I asked, expecting her to know. "The re-entry into our world is automatic if we don't let the fog set in," she said with the air of a foremost authority, which was her trademark. And she was right. Carol and I woke up, at the same time, in the bed of her room in the Regis Hotel. It was so obvious we were back in the world of daily life that we didn't ask questions or make comments about it. The sunlight was nearly blinding. "How did we get back?" Carol asked. Or rather, when did we get back? I had no idea what to say or what to think. I was too numb to speculate, which was all I could have done. Do you think that we just returned? Carol insisted. Or maybe we've been asleep here all night. Look. We're naked. When did we take our clothes off? We took them off in that other world, I said and surprised myself with the sound of my voice. My answer seemed to stump Carol. She looked uncomprehendingly at me and then at her own naked body. We sat there without moving for an endless time. Both of us seemed to be deprived of volition. But then, quite abruptly, we had the same thought at exactly the same time. We got dressed in record time, ran out of the room, went down 2 flights of stairs, crossed the street, and rushed into Don Juan's hotel. Inexplicably and excessively out of breath, since we had not really exerted ourselves physically, we took turns explaining to him what we had done. He confirmed our conjectures. What you two did was about the most dangerous thing one can imagine, he said. He addressed Carol and told her that our attempt had been both a total success and a fiasco. We had succeeded in transferring our awareness of the daily world to our energy bodies, thus making the journey with all our physicality, but we had failed in avoiding the influence of the inorganic beings. He said that ordinarily dreamers experience the whole maneuver as a series of slow transitions, and that they have to voice their intent to use awareness as an element. In our case, all those steps were dispensed with. Because of the intervention of the inorganic beings, the two of us had actually been hurled into a deadly world with a most terrifying speed. It wasn't your combined energy that made your journey possible, he continued. Something else did that. It even selected adequate clothes for you. Do you mean, Nagwal, that the clothes and the bed and the room happened only because we were being run by the inorganic beings? Carol asked. You bet your life, he replied. Ordinarily, dreamers are merely voyeurs. The way your journey turned out, you two got a ringside seat and lived the old sorcerer's damnation. What happened to them was precisely what happened to you. The inorganic beings took them to worlds from which they could not return. I should have known, but it didn't even enter my mind, that the inorganic beings would take over and try to set up the same trap for you too. Do you mean they wanted to keep us there? Carol asked. If you had gotten outside that shack, you'd now be meandering hopelessly in that world, Don Juan said. He explained that since we entered into that world with all our physicality, the fixation of our assemblage points on the position pre-selected by the inorganic beings was so overpowering that it created a sort of fog that obliterated any memory of the world we came from. He added that the natural consequence of such an immobility, as in the case of the sorcerers of antiquity, is that the dreamer's assemblage point cannot return to its habitual position. Think about this, he urged us. Perhaps this is exactly what is happening to all of us in the world of daily life. We are here, and the fixation of our assemblage point is so overpowering that it has made us forget where we came from and what our purpose was for coming here. Don Juan did not want to say any more about our journey. I felt that he was sparing us further discomfort and fear. He took us to eat a late lunch. By the time we reached the restaurant, a couple of blocks down Francisco Madero Avenue, it was 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Carol and I had slept, if that is what we did, about 18 hours. Only Don Juan was hungry. Carol remarked with a touch of anger that he was eating like a pig. Quite a few heads turned in our direction on hearing Don Juan's laughter. It was a warm night. The sky was clear. There was a soft caressing breeze as we sat down on a bench in the Paseo Alameda. "There is a question that's burning me," Carol said to Don Juan. "We didn't use awareness as a medium for traveling, right?" "That's true," Don Juan said and sighed deeply. "The task was to sneak by the inorganic beings, not be run by them." "What's going to happen now?" she asked. "You are going to postpone stalking the stalkers until you two are stronger," he said. "Or perhaps you'll never accomplish it. It doesn't really matter. If one thing doesn't work, another will. Sorcery is an endless challenge." He explained to us again, as if he were trying to fix his explanation in our minds, that in order to use awareness as an element of the environment, dreamers first have to make a journey to the inorganic being's realm. Then they have to use that journey as a springboard, and, while they are in possession of the necessary dark energy, they have to intend to be hurled through the medium of awareness into another world. "The failure of your trip was that you didn't have time to use awareness as an element for traveling," he went on. "Before you even got to the inorganic being's world, you two were already in another world." "What do you recommend we do?" Carol asked. "I recommend that you see as little of each other as possible," he said. "I'm sure the inorganic beings will not pass up the opportunity to get you too, especially if you join forces." So Carol Tiggs and I deliberately stayed away from each other from then on. The prospect that we might inadvertently elicit a similar journey was too great a risk for us. Don Juan encouraged our decision by repeating over and over that we had enough combined energy to tempt the inorganic beings to lure us again. Don Juan brought my dreaming practices back to seeing energy and energy-generating dreamlike states. In the course of time, I saw everything that presented itself to me. I entered in this manner into a most peculiar state. I became incapable of rendering intelligently what I saw. My sensation was always that I had reached states of perception for which I had no lexicon. Don Juan explained my incomprehensible and indescribable visions as my energy body, using awareness as an element not for journeying, because I never had enough energy, but for entering into the energy fields of inanimate matter or of living beings. The tenant. There were no more dreaming practices for me, as I was accustomed to having them. The next time I saw Don Juan, he put me under the guidance of two women of his party, Florinda and Zuleika, his two closest cohorts. Their instruction was not at all about the gates of dreaming, but about different ways to use the energy body, and it did not last long enough to be influential. They gave me the impression that they were more interested in checking me out than in teaching me anything. "There is nothing else I can teach you about dreaming," Don Juan said when I questioned him about this state of affairs. "My time on this earth is up. But Florinda will stay. She's the one who will direct, not only you but all my other apprentices." "Will she continue my dreaming practices?" "I don't know that, and neither does she. It's all up to the spirit. The real player. We are not players ourselves. We are mere pawns in its hands. Following the commands of the spirit, I have to tell you what the fourth gate of dreaming is, although I can't guide you anymore. What's the point of whetting my appetite? I'd rather not know. The spirit is not leaving that up to me or to you. I have to outline the fourth gate of dreaming for you, whether I like it or not." Don Juan explained that, at the fourth gate of dreaming, The energy body travels to specific concrete places, and that there are 3 ways of using the 4th gate. 1. To travel to concrete places in this world. 2. To travel to concrete places out of this world. And 3. To travel to places that exist only in the intent of others. He stated that the last one is the most difficult and dangerous of the 3, and was, by far, the old sorcerer's predilection. "What do you want me to do with this knowledge?" I asked. "Nothing for the moment. File it away until you need it." "Do you mean that I can cross the 4th gate by myself, without help?" "Whether or not you can do that is up to the spirit." He abruptly dropped the subject, but he did not leave me with the sensation that I should try to reach and cross the 4th gate by myself. Don Juan then made one last appointment with me to give me, he said, a sorcerer's send-off. The concluding touch of my dreaming practices. He told me to meet him in the small town in southern Mexico where he and his sorcerer companions lived. I arrived there in the late afternoon. Don Juan and I sat in the patio of his house on some uncomfortable wicker chairs fitted with thick oversized pillows. Don Juan laughed and winked at me. The chairs were a gift from one of the women members of his party, and we simply had to sit as if nothing was bothering us, especially him. The chairs had been bought for him in Phoenix, Arizona, and with great difficulty brought into Mexico. Don Juan asked me to read to him a poem by Dylan Thomas, which he said had the most pertinent meaning for me at that point in time. "I have longed to move away from the hissing of the spent light, and the old terror's continual cry growing more terrible as the day goes over the hill into the deep sea. I have longed to move away but am afraid some life, yet unspent, might explode out of the old lie burning on the ground and, crackling into the air, leave me half blind." Don Juan stood up and said that he was going for a walk in the plaza, in the center of town. He asked me to come along. I immediately assumed that the poem had evoked a negative response in him, and he needed to dispel it. We reached the square plaza without having said a word. We walked around it a couple of times, still not talking. There were quite a number of people milling around the stores on the streets facing the east and north sides of the park. All the streets around the plaza were unevenly paved. The houses were massive, one-story adobe buildings, with tiled roofs, whitewashed walls, and blue or brown painted doors. On a side street, a block away from the plaza, the high walls of the enormous colonial church, which looked like a Moorish mosque, loomed ominously over the roof of the only hotel in town. On the south side, there were 2 restaurants, which inexplicably coexisted side by side, doing good business, serving practically the same menu at the same prices. I broke the silence and asked Don Juan whether he also found it odd that both restaurants were just about the same. "Everything is possible in this town," he replied. The way he said it made me feel uneasy. "Why are you so nervous?" he asked, with a serious expression. "Do you know something you're not telling me?" "Why am I nervous?" "That's a laugh. I am always nervous around you, Don Juan. Sometimes more so than others." He seemed to be making a serious effort not to laugh. "Naguals are not really the most friendly beings on earth," he said in a tone of apology. "I learned this the hard way, being pitted against my teacher, the terrible Nagual Julian. His mere presence used to scare the daylights out of me. And when he used to zero in on me, I always thought my life wasn't worth a plug nickel." Unquestionably, Don Juan, You have the same effect on me." He laughed openly. "No, no. You are definitely exaggerating. I'm an angel in comparison." "You may be an angel in comparison, except that I don't have the Nagual Julian to compare you with." He laughed for a moment, then became serious again. "I don't know why, but I definitely feel scared," I explained. "Do you feel you have reason to be scared?" he asked and stopped walking to peer at me. His tone of voice and his raised eyebrows gave me the impression he suspected that I knew something I was not revealing to him. He was clearly expecting a disclosure on my part. "Your insistence makes me wonder," I said. "Are you sure you are not the one who has something up his sleeve?" "I do have something up my sleeve," he admitted and grinned. "But that's not the issue. The issue is that there is something in this town awaiting you. And you don't quite know what it is, or you do know what it is, but don't dare to tell me, or you don't know anything about it at all. What's waiting for me here?" Instead of answering me, Don Juan briskly resumed his walking, and we kept going around the plaza in complete silence. We circled it quite a few times, looking for a place to sit. Then, a group of young women got up from a bench and left. "For years now, I have been describing to you the aberrant practices of the sorcerers of ancient Mexico," Don Juan said as he sat down on the bench and gestured for me to sit by him. With the fervor of someone who has never said it before, he began to tell me again what he had told me many times, that those sorcerers, guided by extremely selfish interests, put all their efforts into perfecting practices that push them further and further away from sobriety or mental balance. And that they were finally exterminated when their complex edifices of beliefs and practices became so cumbersome that they could no longer support them. The sorcerers of antiquity, of course, lived and proliferated in this area, he said, watching my reaction. "Here in this town. This town was built on the actual foundations of one of their towns. Here in this area, the sorcerers of antiquity carried on all their dealings." "Do you know this for a fact, Don Juan?" "I do, and so will you, very soon." My mounting anxiety was forcing me to do something I detested. To focus on myself. Don Juan, sensing my frustration, egged me on. "Very soon, we'll know whether or not you're really like the old sorcerers or like the new ones," he said. "You are driving me nuts with all this strange and ominous talk," I protested. Being with Don Juan for 13 years had conditioned me, above everything else, to conceive of panic as something that was just around the corner at all times, ready to be released. Don Juan seemed to vacillate. I noticed his furtive glances in the direction of the church. He was even distracted. When I talked to him, he was not listening. I had to repeat my question. "Are you waiting for someone?" "Yes, I am," he said. "Most certainly I am. I was just sensing the surroundings. You caught me in the act of scanning the area with my energy body." "What did you sense, Don Juan?" "My energy body senses that everything is in place. The play is on tonight. You are the main protagonist. I am a character actor with a small but meaningful role. I exit in the first act." "What in the world are you talking about?" He did not answer me. He smiled knowingly. "I'm preparing the ground," he said. "Warming you up, so to speak, harping on the idea that modern-day sorcerers have learned a hard lesson. They have realized that only if they remain totally detached can they have the energy to be free. Theirs is a peculiar type of detachment, which is born not out of fear or indolence, but out of conviction. Don Juan paused and stood up, stretched his arms in front of him, to his sides, and then behind him. Do the same, he advised me. It relaxes the body, and you have to be very relaxed to face what's coming to you tonight. He smiled broadly. Either total detachment or utter indulging is coming to you tonight. It is a choice that every Nagwal in my line has to make. He sat down again and took a deep breath. What he had said seemed to have taken all his energy. I think I can understand detachment and indulging, he went on, because I had the privilege of knowing two Nagwals. My benefactor, the Nagwal Julian, and his benefactor, the Nagwal Elias. I witnessed the difference between the two. The Nagwal Elias was detached to the point that he could put aside a gift of power. The Nagwal Julian was also detached, but not enough to put aside such a gift. Judging by the way you're talking, I said, I would say that you are going to spring some sort of test on me tonight. Is that true? I don't have the power to spring tests of any sort on you, but the Spirit does. He said this with a grin, then added, I am merely its agent. What is the Spirit going to do to me, Don Juan? All I can say is that tonight you're going to get a lesson in dreaming, the way lessons in dreaming used to be, but you are not going to get that lesson from me. Someone else is going to be your teacher and guide you tonight. Who is going to be my teacher and guide? A visitor, who might be a horrendous surprise to you or no surprise at all. And what's the lesson in dreaming I am going to get? It's a lesson about the fourth gate of dreaming. And it is in two parts. The first part I'll explain to you presently. The second part nobody can explain to you, because it is something that pertains only to you. All the Nagwals of my line got this two-part lesson, but no two of those lessons were alike. They were tailored to fit those Nagwals' personal bents of character. Your explanation doesn't help me at all, Don Juan. I am getting more and more nervous. We remained quiet for a long moment. I was shaken up and fidgety, and did not know what else to say without actually nagging. As you already know, for modern-day sorcerers to perceive energy directly is a matter of personal attainment, Don Juan said. We maneuver the assemblage point through self-discipline. For the old sorcerers, the displacement of the assemblage point was a consequence of their subjugation to others, their teachers, who accomplished those displacements through dark operations and gave them to their disciples as gifts of power. It's possible for someone with greater energy than ours to do anything to us, he went on. For example, the Nagwal Julian could have turned me into anything he wanted, a fiend or a saint. But he was an impeccable Nagwal and let me be myself. The old sorcerers were not that impeccable, and, by means of their ceaseless efforts to gain control over others, they created a situation of darkness and terror that was passed on from teacher to disciple. He stood up and swept his gaze all around us. As you can see, this town isn't much, he continued, but it has a unique fascination for the warriors of my line. Here lies the source of what we are, and the source of what we don't want to be. Since I am at the end of my time, I must pass on to you certain ideas, recount to you certain stories, put you in touch with certain beings, right here in this town, exactly as my benefactor did with me. Don Juan said that he was reiterating something I already was familiar with, that whatever he was and everything he knew were a legacy from his teacher, the Nagwal Julian. He in turn inherited everything from his teacher, the Nagwal Elias. The Nagual Elias from the Nagual Rosendo, he from the Nagual Luyan, the Nagual Luyan from the Nagual Santisteban, and the Nagual Santisteban from the Nagual Sebastian. He told me again, in a very formal tone, something he had explained to me many times before, that there were 8 Naguals before the Nagual Sebastian, but that they were quite different. They had a different attitude toward sorcery, a different concept of it, although they were still directly related to his sorcery lineage. You must recollect now, and repeat to me, everything I've told you about the Nagual Sebastian, he demanded. His request seemed odd to me, but I repeated everything I had been told by him or by any of his companions about the Nagual Sebastian and the mythical old sorcerer, the Death Defier, known to them as the Tenant. You know that the Death Defier makes us gifts of power every generation, Don Juan said. And the specific nature of those gifts of power is what changed the course of our lineage. He explained that the Tenant, being a sorcerer from the old school, had learned from his teachers all the intricacies of shifting his assemblage point. Since he had perhaps thousands of years of strange life and awareness, ample time to perfect anything, he knew now how to reach and hold hundreds, if not thousands, of positions of the assemblage point. His gifts were like both maps for shifting the assemblage point to specific spots and manuals on how to immobilize it on any of those positions and thus acquire cohesion. Don Juan was at the peak of his raconteur's form. I had never seen him more dramatic. If I had not known him better, I would have sworn that his voice had the deep and worried inflection of someone gripped by fear or preoccupation. His gestures gave me the impression of a good actor portraying nervousness and concern to perfection. Don Juan peered at me and, in the tone and manner of someone making a painful revelation, he said that, for instance, the Nagual Luyan received from the Tenant a gift of 50 positions. He shook his head rhythmically, as if he were silently asking me to consider what he had just said. I kept quiet. 50 positions? He exclaimed in wonder. For a gift, 1 or, at the most, 2 positions of the assemblage point should be more than adequate. He shrugged his shoulders, gesturing bewilderment. I was told that the Tenant liked the Nagual Luyan immensely, he continued. They struck up such a close friendship that they were practically inseparable. I was told that the Nagual Luyan and the Tenant used to stroll into the church over there every morning for early mass. Right here, in this town? I asked, in total surprise. Right here, he replied. Possibly they sat down on this very spot, on another bench, over 100 years ago. The Nagual Luyan and the Tenant really walked in this plaza? I asked again, unable to overcome my surprise. You bet, he exclaimed. I brought you here tonight because the poem you were reading to me cued me that it was time for you to meet the Tenant. Panic overtook me with the speed of wildfire. I had to breathe through my mouth for a moment. We have been discussing the strange accomplishments of the sorcerers of ancient times, Don Juan continued. But it's always hard when one has to talk exclusively in idealities, without any first-hand knowledge. I can repeat to you from now until doomsday something that is crystal clear to me, but impossible for you to understand or believe, because you don't have any practical knowledge of it. He stood up and gazed at me from head to toe. Let's go to church, he said. The Tenant likes the church and its surroundings. I'm positive this is the moment to go there. Very few times in the course of my association with Don Juan had I felt such apprehension. I was numb. My entire body trembled when I stood up. My stomach was tied in knots, yet I followed him without a word when he headed for the church, my knees wobbling and sagging involuntarily every time I took a step. By the time we had walked the short block from the plaza to the limestone steps of the church portico, I was about to faint. Don Juan put his arm around my shoulders to prop me up. "There's the tenant," he said as casually as if he had just spotted an old friend. I looked in the direction he was pointing and saw a group of 5 women and 3 men at the far end of the portico. My fast and panicked glance did not register anything unusual about those people. I couldn't even tell whether they were going into the church or coming out of it. I noticed, though, that they seemed to be congregated there accidentally. They were not together. By the time Don Juan and I reached the small door, cut out in the church's massive wooden portals, 3 women had entered the church. The 3 men and the other 2 women were walking away. I experienced a moment of confusion and looked at Don Juan for directions. He pointed with a movement of his chin to the holy water font. "We must observe the rules and cross ourselves," he whispered. "Where's the tenant?" I asked, also in a whisper. Don Juan dipped the tips of his fingers in the basin and made the sign of the cross. With an imperative gesture of the chin, he urged me to do the same. "Was the tenant one of the 3 men who left?" I whispered nearly in his ear. "No," he whispered back. "The tenant is one of the 3 women who stayed. The one in the back row." At that moment, a woman in the back row turned her head toward me, smiled, and nodded at me. I reached the door in one jump and ran out. Don Juan ran after me. With incredible agility, he overtook me and held me by the arm. "Where are you going?" he asked, his face and body contorting with laughter. He held me firmly by the arm as I took big gulps of air. I was veritably choking. Peals of laughter came out of him, like ocean waves. I forcefully pulled away and walked toward the plaza. He followed me. "I never imagined you were going to get so upset," he said, as new waves of laughter shook his body. "Why didn't you tell me that the tenant is a woman?" "That sorcerer in there is the death to fire," he said solemnly. "For such a sorcerer, so versed in the shifts of the assemblage point, to be a man or a woman is a matter of choice or convenience. This is the first part of the lesson in dreaming I said you were going to get. And the death to fire is the mysterious visitor who's going to guide you through it." He held his sides as laughter made him cough. I was speechless. Then a sudden fury possessed me. I was not mad at Don Juan or myself or anyone in particular. It was a cold fury, which made me feel as if my chest and all my neck muscles were going to explode. "Let's go back to the church," I shouted, and I didn't recognize my own voice. Now, he said softly. "You don't have to jump into the fire just like that. Think. Deliberate. Measure things up. Cool that mind of yours. Never in your life have you been put to such a test. You need calmness now. I can't tell you what to do," he continued. "I can only, like any other Nagwal, put you in front of your challenge after telling you, in quite oblique terms, everything that is pertinent. This is another of the Nagwal's maneuvers. To say everything without saying it or to ask without asking. I wanted to get it over with quickly. But Don Juan said that a moment's pause would restore whatever was left of my self-assurance. My knees were about to give in. Solicitously, Don Juan made me sit down on the curb. He sat next to me. The first part of the dreaming lesson in question is that maleness and femaleness are not final states, but are the result of a specific act of positioning the assemblage point, he said. And this act is, naturally, a matter of volition and training. Since it was a subject close to the old sorcerers' hearts, they are the only ones who can shed light on it. Perhaps because it was the only rational thing to do, I began to argue with Don Juan. "I can't accept or believe what you are saying," I said. I felt heat rising to my face. "But you saw the woman," Don Juan retorted. "Do you think that all of this is a trick?" "I don't know what to think. That being in the church is a real woman," he said forcefully. "Why should that be so disturbing to you? The fact that she was born a man attests only to the power of the old sorcerer's machinations. This shouldn't surprise you. You have already embodied all the principles of sorcery." My insides were about to burst with tension. In an accusing tone, Don Juan said that I was just being argumentative. With forced patience but real pomposity, I explained to him the biological foundation of maleness and femaleness. "I understand all that," he said. "And you're right in what you're saying. Your flaw is to try to make your assessments universal. What we're talking about are basic principles," I shouted. "They'll be pertinent to man here or in any other place in the universe." "True. True," he said in a quiet voice. "Everything you say is true as long as our assemblage point remains on its habitual position. But the moment it is displaced beyond certain boundaries and our daily world is no longer in function, none of the principles you cherish has the total value you're talking about. Your mistake is to forget that the death defier has transcended those boundaries thousands upon thousands of times. It doesn't take a genius to realize that the tenant is no longer bound by the same forces that bind you now." I told him that my quarrel, if it could be called a quarrel, was not with him, but with accepting the practical side of sorcery, which, up to that moment, had been so far-fetched that it had never posed a real problem to me. I reiterated that, as a dreamer, it was within my experience to attest that in dreaming anything is possible. I reminded him that he himself had sponsored and cultivated this conviction, together with the ultimate necessity for soundness of mind. What he was proposing as the tenant's case was not sane. It was a subject only for dreaming, certainly not for the daily world. I let him know that to me it was an abhorrent and untenable proposition. "Why this violent reaction?" he asked with a smile. His question caught me off guard. I felt embarrassed. "I think it threatens me at the core," I admitted. And I meant it. To think that the woman in the church was a man was somehow nauseating to me. A thought played in my mind. Perhaps the tenant is a transvestite. I queried Don Juan, in earnest, about this possibility. He laughed so hard he seemed about to get ill. "That's too mundane a possibility," he said. "Maybe your old friends would do such a thing. Your new ones are more resourceful and less masturbatory." I repeat. That being in the church is a woman. It is a she. And she has all the organs and attributes of a female. He smiled maliciously. "You've always been attracted to women, haven't you? It seems that this situation has been tailored just for you." His mirth was so intense and childlike that it was contagious. We both laughed. He, with total abandon. I, with total apprehension. I came to a decision then. I stood up and said out loud that I had no desire to deal with the tenant in any form or shape. My choice was to bypass all this business and go back to Don Juan's house and then home. Don Juan said that my decision was perfectly all right with him, and we started back to his house. My thoughts raced wildly. Am I doing the right thing? Am I running away out of fear? Of course, I immediately rationalized my decision as the right and unavoidable one. After all, I assured myself, I was not interested in acquisitions, and the tenant's gifts were like acquiring property. Then doubt and curiosity hit me. There were so many questions I could have asked the death defier. My heart began to pound so intensely I felt it beating against my stomach. The pounding suddenly changed into the emissary's voice. It broke its promise not to interfere and said that an incredible force was accelerating my heartbeat in order to drive me back to the church. To walk toward Don Juan's house was to walk toward my death. I stopped walking and hurriedly confronted Don Juan with the emissary's words. "Is this true?" I asked. "I am afraid it is," he admitted sheepishly. "Why didn't you tell me yourself, Don Juan? Were you going to let me die because you think I am a coward?" I asked in a furious mood. "You were not going to die just like that. Your energy body has endless resources. And it had never occurred to me to think you're a coward. I respect your decisions, and I don't give a damn about what motivates them. You are at the end of the road, just like me. So be a true Nagwal. Don't be ashamed of what you are. If you were a coward, I think you would have died of fright years ago. But if you're too afraid to meet the death defier, then die rather than face him. There is no shame in that. Let's go back to the church," I said, as calmly as I could. "Now we're getting to the crux of the matter," Don Juan exclaimed. "But first, let's go back to the park and sit down on a bench and carefully consider your options. We can spare the time, besides, it's too early for the business at hand." We walked back to the park and immediately found an unoccupied bench and sat down. "You have to understand that only you, yourself, can make the decision to meet or not to meet the tenant or to accept or reject his gifts of power," Don Juan said. "But your decision has to be voiced to the woman in the church, face to face and alone, otherwise it won't be valid." Don Juan said that the tenant's gifts were extraordinary, but that the price for them was tremendous. And that he himself did not approve of either the gifts or the price. "Before you make your real decision," Don Juan continued, "you have to know all the details of our transactions with that sorcerer." "I'd rather not hear about this anymore, Don Juan," I pleaded. "It's your duty to know," he said. "How else are you going to make up your mind? Don't you think that the less I know about the tenant the better off I'll be? No. This is not a matter of hiding until the danger is over. This is the moment of truth. Everything you've done and experienced in the sorcerer's world has channeled you to this spot. I didn't want to say it, because I knew your energy body was going to tell you, but there is no way to get out of this appointment. Not even by dying. Do you understand?" He shook me by the shoulders. "Do you understand?" he repeated. I understood so well that I asked him if it would be possible for him to make me change levels of awareness in order to alleviate my fear and discomfort. He nearly made me jump with the explosion of his no. "You must face the death to fire and coldness and with ultimate premeditation," he went on. "And you can't do this by proxy." Don Juan calmly began to repeat everything he had already told me about the death to fire. As he talked, I realized that part of my confusion was the result of his use of words. He rendered death to fire in Spanish as el desafiante de la muerte and tenant as el inquilino, both of which automatically denote a male. But in describing the relationship between the tenant and the naguals of his line, Don Juan kept on mixing the Spanish language male and female gender denotation, creating a great confusion in me. He said that the tenant was supposed to pay for the energy he took from the naguals of our lineage, but that whatever he paid has bound those sorcerers for generations. As payment for the energy taken from all those naguals, the woman in the church taught them exactly what to do to displace their assemblage point to some specific positions, which she herself had chosen. In other words, she bound every one of those men with a gift of power, consisting of a pre-selected specific position of the assemblage point and all its implications. What do you mean by all its implications, Don Juan? I mean the negative results of those gifts. The woman in the church knows only of indulging. There is no frugality, no temperance in that woman. For instance, she taught the nagual Julian how to arrange his assemblage point to be, just like her, a woman. Teaching this to my benefactor, who was an incurable voluptuary, was like giving booze to a drunkard. But isn't it up to each one of us to be responsible for what we do? Yes, indeed. However, some of us have more difficulty than others in being responsible. To augment that difficulty deliberately, as that woman does, is to put too much unnecessary pressure on us. How do you know the woman in the church does this deliberately? She has done it to every one of the naguals of my line. If we look at ourselves fairly and squarely, we have to admit that the death to fire has made us, with his gifts, into a line of very indulging, dependent sorcerers. I could not overlook his inconsistency of language usage any longer, and I complained to him. You have to speak about that sorcerer as either a male or a female, but not as both, I said harshly. I'm too stiff, and your arbitrary use of gender makes me all the more uneasy. I am very uneasy myself, he confessed. But the truth is that the death to fire is both male and female. I've never been able to take that sorcerer's change with grace. I was sure you would feel the same way, having seen him as a man first. Don Juan reminded me of a time, years before, when he took me to meet the death to fire and I met a man, a strange Indian who was not old but not young either, and was very slightly built. I remember mostly his strange accent and his use of one odd metaphor when describing things he allegedly had seen. He said, "Mis ojos si pasaran, my eyes walked on." For instance, he said, "My eyes walked on the helmets of the Spanish conquerors." The event was so fleeting in my mind that I had always thought the meeting had lasted only a few minutes. Don Juan later told me that I had been gone with the death to fire for a whole day. The reason I was trying to find out from you earlier whether you knew what was going on, Don Juan continued, was because I thought that years ago you had made an appointment with the death to fire yourself. You were giving me undue credit, Don Juan. In this instance, I really don't know whether I am coming or going. But what gave you the idea that I knew? The death to fire seemed to have taken a liking to you. And that meant to me that he might have already given you a gift of power, although you didn't remember it. Or he might have set up your appointment with him, as a woman. I even suspected she had given you precise directions. Don Juan remarked that the death to fire, being definitely a creature of ritual habits, always met the Naguals of his line first as a man, as it had happened with the Nagual Sebastian, and subsequently as a woman. Why do you call the Death Defiers gifts, gifts of power? And why the mystery? I asked. You yourself can displace your assemblage point to whatever spot you want, isn't that so? They are called gifts of power because they are products of the specialized knowledge of the sorcerers of antiquity, he said. The mystery about the gifts is that no one on this earth, with the exception of the Death Defier, can give us a sample of that knowledge. And, of course, I can displace my assemblage point to whatever spot I want, inside or outside man's energy shape. But what I can't do, and only the Death Defier can, is to know what to do with my energy body in each one of those spots, in order to get total perception, total cohesion. He explained, then, that modern-day sorcerers do not know the details of the thousands upon thousands of possible positions of the assemblage point. What do you mean by details? I asked. Particular ways of treating the energy body in order to maintain the assemblage point fixed on specific positions, he replied. He took himself as an example. He said that the Death Defier's gift of power to him had been the position of the assemblage point of a crow and the procedures to manipulate his energy body to get the total perception of a crow. Don Juan explained that total perception, total cohesion was what the old sorcerers sought at any cost, and that, in the case of his own gift of power, total perception came to him by means of a deliberate process he had to learn, step by step, as one learns to work a very complex machine. Don Juan further explained that most of the shifts modern-day sorcerers experience are mild shifts within a thin bundle of energetic luminous filaments inside the luminous egg, a bundle called the band of man, or the purely human aspect of the universe's energy. Beyond that band, but still within the luminous egg, lies the realm of the grand shifts. When the assemblage point shifts to any spot on that area, perception is still comprehensible to us, but extremely detailed procedures are required for perception to be total. The inorganic beings tricked you and Carol Tiggs in your last journey by helping you two to get total cohesion on a grand shift, Don Juan said. They displaced your assemblage points to the farthest possible spot, then helped you perceive there as if you were in your daily world. A nearly impossible thing. To do that type of perceiving, a sorcerer needs pragmatic knowledge or influential friends. Your friends would have betrayed you in the end and left you and Carol to fend for yourselves and learn pragmatic measures in order to survive in that world. You two would have ended filled to the brim with pragmatic procedures, just like those most knowledgeable old sorcerers. Every grand shift has different inner workings, he continued, which modern sorcerers could learn if they knew how to fixate the assemblage point long enough at any grand shift. Only the sorcerers of ancient times had the specific knowledge required to do this. Don Juan went on to say that the knowledge of specific procedures involved in shifts was not available to the 8 Naguals who preceded the Nagual Sebastian, and that the tenant showed the Nagual Sebastian how to achieve total perception on 10 new positions of the assemblage point. The Nagual Santisteban received 7, the Nagual Luyan 50, the Nagual Rosendo 6, the Nagual Elias 4, the Nagual Julian 16, and he was shown 2. That made a total of 95 specific positions of the assemblage point that his lineage knew about. He said that if I asked him whether he considered this an advantage to his lineage, he would have to say no, because the weight of those gifts put them closer to the old sorcerer's mood. Now it's your turn to meet the tenant, he continued. Perhaps the gifts he will give you will offset our total balance, and our lineage will plunge into the darkness that finished off the old sorcerers. This is so horribly serious, it's sickening, I said. I most sincerely sympathize with you, he retorted with a serious expression. I know it's no consolation to you if I say that this is the toughest trial of a modern Nagwal. To face something so old and mysterious as the tenant is not awe-inspiring but revolting. At least it was to me, and still is. Why do I have to continue with it, Don Juan? Because, without knowing it, you accepted the Death to Fire challenge. I drew an acceptance from you in the course of your apprenticeship, in the same manner my teacher drew one from me, surreptitiously. I went through the same horror, only a little more brutally than you. He began to chuckle. The Nagwal Julian was given to playing horrendous jokes. He told me that there was a very beautiful and passionate widow who was madly in love with me. The Nagwal used to take me to church often, and I had seen the woman staring at me. I thought she was a good-looking woman. And I was a horny young man. When the Nagwal said that she liked me, I fell for it. My awakening was very rude. I had to fight not to laugh at Don Juan's gesture of lost innocence. Then the idea of his predicament hit me, as being not funny but ghastly. Are you sure, Don Juan, that that woman is the tenant? I asked, hoping that perhaps it was a mistake or a bad joke. I am very, very sure, he said. Besides, even if I were so dumb as to forget the tenant, my seeing can't fail me. Do you mean, Don Juan, that the tenant has a different type of energy? No, not a different type of energy, but certainly different energy features than a normal person. Are you absolutely sure, Don Juan, that that woman is the tenant? I insisted, driven by a strange revulsion and fear. That woman is the tenant. Don Juan exclaimed in a voice that admitted no doubts. We remained quiet. I waited for the next move in the midst of a panic beyond description. I have already said to you that to be a natural man or a natural woman is a matter of positioning the assemblage point, Don Juan said. By natural I mean someone who was born either male or female. To a seer, the shiniest part of the assemblage point faces outward, in the case of females, and inward, in the case of males. The tenant's assemblage point was originally facing inward, but he changed it by twisting it around and making his egg-like energy shape look like a shell that is curled up on itself. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.